Welcome, everybody. Glad that you're here. And we have a special guest lined up for us who's going to be bringing the topic maximizing board effectiveness. And yes, it is the one and only Dr. Jim Galvin. He wrote the book, Maximizing Board Effectiveness. He's done the work. Maximizing board effectiveness has a lot of experience and wisdom to bring to the table. So we're excited for this webinar this morning. We will have some time for Q&A. So if you want to write down a question, put it in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that and running some questions past Jim. If you already have a question, feel free to drop those in the chat box, but I'm assuming there might be some questions spurred on as Jim's presenting the topic this morning. So feel free to drop those in there, but we will put some time, set some time aside for the Q&A. Then we'll wrap up with some other things that are coming up in the future. But with that outline for this morning, I'll hand it over to Kent to make a quick introduction.
Well, thanks, Aaron. And yes, it's all about Jim Galvin. And I hear that's kind of the way it is all the time in Jim's life. Jim, it's really great to have you with us today. A lot of things I'd love to share, but if you haven't seen this book, if you don't have this book, you should get it. Excellent book. And in fact, I'm looking right now at page 43. I love the framework about the three different types of boards and kind of helping to navigate that. Can't wait to hear what Jim has to bring today. But just for a quick introduction, a lot of things I could say about Jim, and I promised him I wouldn't say most of them. Jim is certainly, he's an accomplished leader. He's a published author. He's an insightful advisor. But to me, Jim is a friend and he's an inspiration. And I can't wait to hear, Jim, what you have to share today and for the rest of those on today's call to get acquainted with you. So with that, tell us about maximizing board effectiveness.
All right. Thank you for the embarrassing introduction. And people sometimes ask, when you started in consulting, Jim, you weren't doing anything with boards, and now you're doing a lot with boards. And my joke is, well, I'm old enough to do that kind of work now. And let's face it, nobody graduates from college aspiring to work with boards. So you sort of have to grow into it, you have to back into it. And for me, it was a church that was a client of mine, helping them with strategic planning. And the pastor called me up and said, Jim, I got a problem with my board. He said, have you read Boards That Make a Difference by John Carver? I said, no. He goes, read it and then come down and help me with my board. So I had been avoiding governance because it sounds so boring. And when, and convoluted and I don't like most board meetings. Right? Maybe you don't like most board meetings either. So I got the book, I read it, and I thought, this is actually pretty interesting and it actually makes sense. And you can solve a lot of the dysfunction that's out there. So helping dysfunctional boards become more effective is one of the things they do, or helping decent boards go to the next level, or helping working boards become policy-based boards is what I did. So as I went beyond the book, Boards That Make a Difference, beyond the Carver model, I found the literature to be conflicting. So perhaps you recognize some of these conflicts of advice and direction of experts writing on boards. For example, some will say you need a skills matrix. So someone with accounting expertise, someone who maybe is a lawyer, someone who maybe works in HR, and then they can be advisors you can tap. And on the other side, people are going, the last kind of person you want on your board is an accountant, a lawyer, HR person, because they'll totally be focused on operations. So how can both of these be true at the same time? Term limits is another one, you know, you have to have term limits. And the other saying, you know, that'll happen naturally. You don't need term limits. And in fact, if you got a really good board chair and the organization's in a difficult space, you don't want to lose that leadership when you're going through rough waters. The term limits are bad. So are they bad or are they good? Well, you got to get rid of the deadwood, allows fresh thinking. Others are going, no, you want the experience, you want the expertise that they have, the deep knowledge and history of the organization. So again, there's two sides that are conflicting. Some are saying, oh, you want to invite major donors on your board. And others are going, not necessarily, because there's other ways to get donors involved to show appreciation. Getting them on the board, you know, they might not be the right kind of people for your board to help with the kind of decisions that you need to make. But I think people default to bringing donors on your board because they have no other way to engage them. And so if they think of another way, but again, you see, yeah, you got to have major donors, and no, maybe not the best idea. So conflicting literature. Some say you should meet monthly or put in your bylaws at least 10 times a year. Others go, well, you know, ECFA minimum is 2 times face-to-face and 1 time on telephone. Just go with that. That's better. Fewer meetings, more in depth versus monthly meetings. So which is right? Some say you need standing committees. So for a university, that would include a finance committee, a student life committee, an academics committee, a governing committee, maybe another committee on facilities, so that they can oversee different parts of this large, complex organization. And then on the other hand, people are saying you want as few standing committees as possible, ideally none, and a small enough board where you can do the work all together that has to be done. And if you have all these committees, they'll just drag you into operations anyway. So what's going on? How come there's so much conflicting advice? So in doing some thinking on that, using basic systems theory, which means for every entity, any organization that's out there, there's inputs going into it, processes happening on the outside, and outputs coming out the other end. So in a computer, you got input device like a keyboard, you have a microprocessor, and you got output in terms of printed paper or electronic file going through it. Same is true in businesses, same is true sociologically, same is true in small groups, same is true in organizations. There's inputs coming into the organization of people, clients or customers, information, technology, and finances. There's processes happening of all the operations where the organization does what it does. And if you're a nonprofit, outputs coming out in terms of changed lives or changed community. So what are the results you're trying to seek? So I realized, you know, maybe there's a way to synthesize all this conflicting information by saying there are basically 3 kinds of boards: managing boards, governing boards, and navigating boards, which is something that's not out there in the literature. It's just assuming there's a board of directors or trustees, and they vary in how they function, but basically they're all the same. Other parts of the literature going, no, there's about 25 different kind of boards: patronage board, working board, advisory board, you know, and they list all these different names and all these different kinds. But again, there's no cohesion to it. So let's say there's 3 types of boards. Using systems theory, your organization is in the black box, and there's all the operations, everything that it does, all the events that it does, all the people it serves is all happening inside the black box. The board is above that box, looking at it and watching what's happening. They're looking at the inputs coming in, the activities happening inside the box, and the results coming out the other side. But there's 3 basic ways that the board can monitor and act on that black box. One is to open the lid and look inside and maybe start pointing and giving advice, or reaching down in and moving some of the pieces. That's a managing board. The second way is to leave the lid closed and write policies about what you don't want to have happen inside the box, and ends policies about where you're going. And then look at the inputs going in, keep the lid closed, look at the inputs going in and the outputs coming out the other side, the resources and results, and keep asking the question, is it worth it? Are the results we're seeing worth all the resources going in? And again, developing policies to move it forward. The third thing you can do, because the environment is becoming turbulent, is pick up the box and move it to a different place. Change the mission, change the territory, change the branding, change the CEO, change the type of work that you do. So for example, if you have a managing board, let's say you're on the board of a dog shelter and you're only 5 years old, and you have a director who is part-time, and you have 75 volunteers. So just one staff person. And the volunteers run everything. They feed the dogs, take care of the dogs, wash the dogs, find the adoptive parents for them. It's a pretty low budget operation. And your director is a sweet, wonderful woman. Everyone loves to be with her, happy to volunteer for her, but she has a really hard time making decisions, like coming to the board meeting and saying, you know, we need to give the dogs dry dog food, but when they first come, we want to give them some wet dog food, but we don't want to spoil them, then they won't eat the dry dog food, and maybe we should mix some of the wet food in for the first 2 weeks. What do you all think? Well, that board has to be a managing board. They can't write a policy and let her run it because she has too many flat spots. She can't do everything that needs to be done. So the board is forced into managing the finances, making decisions about operations, but to be effective, they should stay at a high level in that. On the other hand, if you have like a community hospital, which is a large complex organization, and the community hospital looks for leading members in the community and invites them on the board, being a nonprofit, they have to have a board and register in the state where they operate, just like all 50 states. But the hospital board cannot be a managing board because you're dealing with Medicare, you're dealing with disease and research, you're dealing with doctors, you're dealing with unions, you're dealing with FDA. And so those board members, those leading community board members, have no expertise. In fact, the only qualification they have to be on the hospital board is that they've been to the doctor. Every department in a hospital loses money except one, and that's surgery. How are you going to advise the hospital administration on how much money each department should lose? Right? You have no expertise. So you have to up your game and become a governing board. And the governing board sets the direction for the organization, sets the policies, oversees, monitors the finances, and then hires the organizational leader to run everything. And so they're simply going to govern, monitor, and think strategically about the future. And whenever you have an organization that is complex, large, extremely technical, or the staff, your staff or director is highly knowledgeable, what happens is you have a sharp organization with board members that are basically a bunch of volunteers overseeing trained professionals. So in that kind of situation, if you don't want to mess things up by micromanaging, you need to become a governing board and set policy rather than making decisions or getting involved in operations. So that's where you leave the lid closed and look at what's coming in and going out, but you have to monitor closely. It's one of the biggest mistakes policy boards make. They write the policy manual, then they don't look at anything anymore, not even the policy manual. Third type of board is navigating board. And that's where you pick up the box and move it somewhere else because you're in a turbulent environment. I'm working with the Social Service Agency board right now. They have been involved in foster care. And they're a Christian organization. They have a lot of good church support. They have a lot of volunteers from these churches. And the state has changed their regulations about adoptive parents and adoptive children and who you can, what children you can put with what type of parents. And they're saying, you know, we're out of here. This is violating our Christian standards. We have to get out of the foster care business. But they have all this church support. They got good relationships with these churches. They got volunteers. What can they do with that that's similar? So they can't do, they're not going to do foster care anymore, but what else could they do to help children? And they still have all these assets that can be used. So they got to change their mission. This happened historically around the 1950s. Tuberculosis Sanatorium in Wheat Ridge, Colorado, had a big campus there up near the mountains, and tuberculosis was cured. So what do? Do they focus on a different kind of disease? But they didn't need a sanatorium for it. So they decided to sell their campus and take all the money and create a foundation, which was then called Wheat Ridge Foundation, that focused on raising money and giving gifts to churches and ministries involved with some kind of healthcare related ministry. So they changed what they did, they changed where they were located, they changed their name, they changed their mission, but still focused on healthcare in general. So that's a navigating board. So one of the questions I ask people then is, what kind of board are you right now, and what kind of board do you want to be? All three boards are legitimate. All three boards can be done effectively or ineffectively. So if the best fit for you is a managing board, how do you do it effectively? You do it like a high-level executive management team. So if you're overseeing 5 factories, you're not going in and changing operations in all the factories. You're getting the financial results, you're getting the market studies, and you're overseeing the whole thing at a high level. You're staying out of the weeds, you're avoiding micromanaging because you've hired a general manager for each factory. The general manager runs everything. You just want to look at the results coming out the other side and decide whether to add a new factory or to sell a factory, those kinds of things. So if you stay out of the weeds, stay out of micromanaging, and stay up at the more executive level, then a managing board can work. And I think that's probably the best fit for about 50% of the nonprofits in the US, because they're either too small or they don't have fully competent staff, or maybe no staff, right? So again, they have to be managing. So all the policy-based stuff doesn't apply. what kind of people you want on a managing board. You want people who understand the work. Maybe they have a background in accounting, maybe they have background as a lawyer. Maybe they have HR expertise, right? Because you need all that to help the organization grow, to help it become more effective, to find and hire a CEO to take you to the next level. So you got to stay out of the weeds and up into the higher level decision making. If you have a large complex organization or extremely well-trained staff, or maybe it's a technical field like the Alliance Defense Fund, right? Large organization, a lot of lawyers working in there. You can't tell them how to defend First Amendment rights. That you have to be a governing board. You have to stay out of operations, get up into the higher level, talk about what results do we want to see, how fast do we want to grow, what direction are we heading. And they just made a major move to buy a big office building in Washington, D.C., moving out of Arizona, I guess retaining their office in Arizona. So again, that board has to be on the governing level, setting policies and direction, because they can't give any advice to the highly educated people that work there. So how do you be effective as a policy board? You stay out of operations, you focus on resources and results, you develop a policy manual, you review the policies all the time, you keep it a living document, you monitor the organization closely for the results you're achieving and anything that might be going wrong. And you can write policies on anything, and there's several different formats you can use for developing the policy manual, but the policy manual is the tool to help the board be effective. And you don't want accountants, lawyers, HR people, because they'll keep dragging you into operations. You need people who are strategic thinkers, who can understand the needs you're trying to meet in society or with your clients, and thinking long range. I'm working with a camp right now that's installing a new board. And my first piece of advice was forget the summer. Don't even think about this summer. It's already planned. It's already done. You can't impact it. Think about next fall and the following summer and what kind of changes need to be made in the camp. So they're got to get on that strategic level, which you can when you're in the governing posture. Third, if the organization is facing a crisis, if the environment is changing in a chaotic way, then the board has to set the policy manual aside and get involved in moving the box somewhere else, right? It's not working here. We need to move. We need to move our office. We need to move to a new mission. We need to expand and change our donor base. So whatever it is, they're hands-on making big changes, but they're not in the organization doing that. They're more outside of it, making directional shifts. And so the ineffective way of doing that is think of a board of a museum. Okay, the environment's changing, the society's changing, and they're raising money and working really hard to keep everything the same inside the organization. Keep the history museum the same, keep the museum of the town the same, right? Don't change anything, even though everything outside of it's changed. That's the ineffective way to do it. They ought to be adapting to their changing environment. The more effective way is to be transformational. Say what has to change in the organization, what's changing in our environment. Do we need to move to a different direction? So I'm gonna, one last point, and then we'll take questions and answers on that. So some of these three modes of operating, managing, governing, navigating. Some people say, well, this month, let's have a managing board meeting. Next month, let's be governing. And then maybe once a year, we should be in navigating mode. And that's not the point at all. The point is, what are the conditions you're operating in? Do you have to be a managing board? Okay, you're going to be that for a long time until you can gear up, level up to become a policy board. If you're a policy board, you don't want to be dipping into management. That's called micromanaging. That's what the policies are set to do, is keep you out of operations because you've hired people to do that. So you don't want to be shifting back and forth. If you're forced into navigating mode, like your ministry is being sued for child abuse or something like that, you have to step in and protect and rescue and save the organization and redirect it. And you don't want to stay in that mode for a long time. You want to resolve the crisis, get the new direction set, and then move back into policy, governance, or managing mode, whatever you were before, because there's too much stress in that navigating side. So you may look back on the history of your organization and say, you know, before we were managing, now we're policy based, or, you know, remember when that crisis hit and the board went into navigating mode for 1.5 years to get us out of it. We'll pause there for any questions you might have.
Yeah, wow, Jim, you've touched on some really important concepts. Did you just make all this stuff up?
Yeah. There is no other literature on 3 types of boards.
Hey, any idea how many boards you've advised or consulted over the years?
Probably about 100.
Wow, a lot of experience. And so we've got a question from Robert. It's in the chat box. And by the way, later on, as Aaron mentioned, we're going to ask everybody just to take a minute and share a takeaway. So be thinking along those lines. But Robert says, can you talk about being a fiduciary when serving as a board member? What's this fiduciary?
Yeah, that's your legal obligation to be the duty of loyalty. I forget the other 2. Duty of
Obedience.
Yep, duty of obedience. Maybe you remember the 3rd one. So you have to take care of the organization and act in the best interest of the organization. That's a legal obligation. And that's true no matter what kind of board you are. But if you're policy based and you use a consent agenda and you receive all the reports in the first 10 minutes, your fiduciary duties are done. They're taken care of. And you can move to the strategic level, but you can never neglect your fiduciary duty.
Well, actually, the neglect of the fiduciary duty is what opens up another door of service. It's called prison. And who wants to go there? Yeah, nobody.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah. I'm working with one board, the organization, you would know who it is. And the organization and all the board members individually are being sued for defamation of character. So they overstepped.
Important stuff.
Another question we got in, what's the number one mistake that you see in the boardroom?
That's a good question. Every board has its own unique dysfunctions. It might be smaller, they might be big. To name the biggest one would be hard, but not paying attention would rank right up there.
Okay. Paying attention. George raised his hand. George, I'm going to unmute. Or I think you unmuted yourself. Go ahead, George.
Hi,
George.
how are you?
Good to see you.
I'm good, thank you. Me too. I'm working with organizations throughout California that have usually small shops, but they're part of large complex organizations. The EDs normally think that their board members are either not engaged enough or too engaged. And they're probably in the governing board need area because, you know, these EDs have some skills and they have small teams and they do nice work, but they can't get board members engaged enough, or they have the meddling board member. How would you advise those folks?
Yeah, get the right people. And if the EDs are competent, probably move to policy-based governance. I think when John Carver from Canada developed that framework, I think it was to solve the problem of dysfunctional boards that were either disengaged, you know, letting the ED pull the wagon and they're riding in it, or micromanaging, which are the two tendencies boards tend to have. They don't know what their job is. They don't know how to think strategically. They're not looking ahead far enough. They're not monitoring closely. There's a lot of work for a board to do together, but micromanaging is one that they should not. So how do you, and it sometimes flips, like they're disengaged, you know, not paying attention. Then there's what I call the $100,000 oops. And then they want detailed financial reports and trying to figure out what this, how come we didn't know about this? How can we fix this? Where can we move some money to solve this problem? And again, they shouldn't be solving that. They should be asking the director to solve it. And so to keep that flip and flop from happening, if you develop a policy manual and stick to that, it keeps you centered and out of operations and looking forward strategically. So that's the value of policy-based governance.
Thank you. And I assume job descriptions for board members would be helpful in that policy manual.
It should always be in there. Yeah.
Thanks.
So we've got a question in the chat box. Dwight says, I find it interesting that a CEO that is under a governing board does not want to be micromanaged, then turns around and micromanages his competent staff. How do you handle that, Jim? Good question, Dwight.
If it's causing the organization to flounder, according to Carver, you replace the CEO immediately. But that does happen. I've seen another nonprofit where that you would all know, where the CEO dealt collegially with the higher level execs and treated all the employees like they worked at Burger King.
Oh, wow.
So again, it's viewing them as objects instead of image bearers of God, right? Instead of supervising in an effective way. So again, they can't, if they're not doing the job right, if they're floundering or if they're causing the organization to not achieve the results it needs to achieve, then that CEO needs to be replaced. It's not a popular viewpoint.
Well, but Jim, I think what you're talking about goes back to, in a way, the response to George's question, and that is having defined roles.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times people who are serving in a board seat don't know what their lane is that they're supposed to stay in. Oftentimes CEOs don't have a clear understanding of what their lane is to stay in it. And so your example of the policy manual helps to address some of that, gives us an opportunity to actually succeed.
Yes. And also CEOs can sometimes cause their own problem. So if you're switched to policy-based and their board's trying to stay on a governing level, if you're the CEO, never ask your board for advice on an operational issue. So if they give you advice and you don't take it, are they going to be mad? You just invited them into operations. The other mistake is to bring like a business manager or principal or someone into the board meetings as well. It's a trap door for the board to get into operational issues and ask detailed financial questions about a $150 expense. Or as one church board said, Pastor, you're giving too much money on tips when you go out for lunch. You shouldn't do that. So get rid of all the trapdoors to operations if you're going to be a policy-based board.
Yeah, wow. So we've got one more question here. Let's do this, and then after that, we'll go to the top takeaway. How does that sound? So Rachel says, we are a very young nonprofit. A couple of the board members are also involved in volunteering in the organization. Is that a good thing if they understand their separate roles, or is it generally not recommended? I do not see it as a problem right now, but could see it potentially be a problem down the line. Jim, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, should you have volunteers on your board or should they be separate? Depends on the organization, but in general, wouldn't you want board members who are fully engaged in your work? But on the other hand, they know what's happening on the inside. And are they going to bring up those issues in the board meetings? Like, there's a problem with how the lockers were assigned for the students this year. We should deal with it. The answer is no, you probably shouldn't. But again, it becomes a trap door. So we have what's called the 3-hat rule, which is you have your board hat, which you wear during the board meetings. And then you have your volunteer hat when you're serving in the organization. And hopefully you also have a donor hat because you're invested financially into the work as well. So I would be fine. I would want board members that are deeply engaged like that, but who also know how to stay in their lane as a board member and what their job is when you're meeting as a board. Closely related to that is a church board member that walks around during the week telling staff people what to do because they're on the board. They didn't take the board hat off. They have to put their member hat on. And they're a member just like anyone else. So the 3-hat rule is helpful.
That's
Yeah,
really
very good.
good. I think there's probably a lot of people on the call that can relate to that question. So thanks, Rachel, for asking that question.
Yeah, I would also add, what if you got an engaged volunteer who's also a board member that's getting into the weeds? You sit them down and say, pick one, right? You can be a board member or you can be a volunteer, but you're unable to do both. So pick one. Which would you prefer?
Wow. Jim, you have such a way of making things simple. And it's just the execution that gives us challenges, right? Yeah. So in just a minute, we've got a couple of things to wrap up, but I'd love for you to go to the chat box. What's your top takeaway? Maybe a bullet point, a phrase, or a sentence, and we'll come back and review those here in just a minute. But Aaron, you want to kind of give us an overview of what's coming up?
Yeah, next month we have another 47-minute webinar. We're going to be talking about leading with integrity. It's going to be a couple different nuances and perspectives we take on integrity, but this will be a great one to invite board to staff, volunteers. This it kind of even plays into the fiduciary idea. If we all practice integrity, that loyalty and care and duty would take care of itself. So that's May 16th, again, 10 a.m. to 10:47 a.m. We also have some Asking Academies coming up. This is a great opportunity to get your team working together when it comes to fundraising. A lot of times board members will join a couple staff and maybe fundraising volunteers and learn how to ask for some major gifts. So the Asking Academy Classic, which has a in-person summit on May 9th and 10th, That's intended for teams. That's coming up quick. So if you're interested in that, drop a line real quick and I'll make note of that and follow up with you. We also have the Asking Academy Express, which is geared towards individuals. If you can't make it as a team, but you want to send one person from your organization just to get that expertise on major gift solicitation, the Asking Academy Express is great. It's online through the Zoom platform. So we have that coming up as well. And if anyone's going to be in the Dallas area for the AFP conference coming up at the end of June, we will be there talking about volunteer leadership training. So we'd love to see some people in Dallas as well. Again, if you're in the area and plan on be there, drop a line here or send me a text or a message, and would love to connect in person in Dallas also. Let's go back to the chat box and see what some of the big takeaways were.
Let's see. Yeah, what are some of those big takeaways? With several responses. Let's see, the three different types of boards and the various functions is very helpful. Gijo, same thing. Says, I'm new, it's a great learning experience. Jim, I think the three board types is really ringing a bell here. George calls that out also, and how to discern scope creep between them. Gay Prescott, Gay, great to have you in the room today. Just combined our boards, operational foundation. One was managing, the other's governing. This will give some clear direction on how to be a governing board for both entities. Good for you, and best wishes on that. Randy, identifying a potential board member's heart and passion before asking them to be a member of the board. What motivates them, and does the mission match their passion? Wow. Absolutely essential. And let's see, Peter, we're at a governing board level. The situation, some of them keep trying to manage. Jim, does that sound familiar?
Yep.
I'll be sharing a lot of this info with the board. Please do it without using a club. And if you have to club them, just be sure that they know it's coming from Jim Galvin. Let's see, educational portion of the meeting, great content. Dwight says his takeaway is navigating board is new language and helpful if the other two are not helpful at this time in the organization. Yeah. Rachel's biggest takeaway is that as a board, we're spending too much time discussing operational issues. Wow. And, Rachel, I really appreciate you mentioning that. Sometime for fun, appoint a board member at the beginning of the meeting just to keep track of the time and how we're spending it. Is it operational? Is it policy? Is it, a lot of times I see tons of time burned up looking in the rearview mirror, arguing about the treasurer's report or the secretary's report for the last meeting. It's a report, it's historical. Wow, everybody's done a great job of speaking into today's webinar. We're going to wrap up here in just a little bit. Aaron, what else do we need to do before we hit the 47-minute mark?
Well, let's all give a round of applause, either live or virtually, to our guest, Jim Galvin. Jim, thanks for joining us. Appreciate you taking time out of your day to prepare for this and be here with us. It's impactful for a lot of people. And I'll say to our audience, if this is a webinar that you feel would be good to pass on to a board member, we're going to upload it to YouTube. So send me a message if you want the link. I'll post it on LinkedIn, but would love to make this easy for you to share as well.
And Jim, what's the easiest way for people to reach you?
Just Google Galvin and Associates. It'll be on the first page.
There you go. Well, you've brought a lot of value today. Thank you, Jim, for taking time out and sharing your experience, your insight, and look forward to seeing everybody next month. What is it? May the 11th is next month is really May. I guess so. But in the meantime, like Aaron said, thanks for being in the room today. and love to connect. If Jim can be of help, feel free to reach out to him. I highly recommend Jim and his team. And if there are ways that we can support what you're doing, don't hesitate to reach out to Aaron or to me. And with that, we'll say goodbye and hope you have a great week. See you next time.